Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Dan Andros, and I'm joined today by Ravi Zacharia, one of the best, Christian apologetics people out there. And I appreciate you being here. You're automatically raising the intelligence quotient by about a million percent. I'm kind of new, dabbling into the apologetics world on my faith journey. I don't know. I kind of just believed and just went in head first, and now I'm kind of backtracking and going down the really trying to, all right, let me just examine all of these beliefs and make sure I really believe what I say I believe. And it's working out well. But you're one of the voices who I appreciate being out there because you explain things and, complex things in such a simple way. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Dan. Good to be with you. And, actually, that's true of many. My own conversion in India, from a background of, I guess I was just not interested in the religious world at all because India is immersed in it. But then once you make that commitment, you have to start examining it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to start asking the right questions. Paul himself, came to know Christ in that dramatic Damascus Road experience, then had to go away for about 3 years to just truly understand, and he was ever learning. So not a problem, and actually apologetics, if you're too immersed in it, can become almost a crutch you lean on. It's the person of Christ that you really have to turn to in terms of your answers and why it all makes sense in explanatory power. That's the key, I think.
Absolutely. And your book, the new book you have out, is Why Suffering, Finding the Meaning and Comfort When Life Doesn't Make Sense. And I love this topic because so many times you see it, especially now on Facebook and social media, in the comments below a story, if there's a tragic event or something like that, and somebody will say, wow, that was horrible, I'm praying for these people. And then you'll inevitably get the comment underneath it where they're saying like, oh, well, what are you praying to this God for? I mean, he was apparently too weak to let this happen or didn't care enough to let this happen. And so you're obviously addressing that. And what do you say to people like that, if you encounter them?
First of all, I understand where they're coming from. To diminish that evocative response is to be out of touch with reality. Which of us has not thought that, especially when there was so-called the most vulnerable in our society? But I think the problem of evil, so linked to the problem of suffering, is something we don't like to connect. We only like to think of symptoms. We don't like to think of causes. We only like to think of hurts and pains and anguish. We don't like to think of responsibility and what it is that brings this all about. My first response, my initial response always is this a valid question or not? That's key. Is the question legitimate or not? And the only way it could be legitimate is if this is a moral universe, that we have a moral framework in which to think. Can naturalism really justify a moral framework? The answer is no. The reason we ask this question is because as human beings, we frame questions morally. So I have to take them back to the assumptions that lie behind the question. If the assumption is moral reasoning is valid, then you can only justify it if there's a moral lawgiver. And if there's a moral lawgiver, then there goes naturalism in its assumptions. So once the assumptions are accepted, then you can find a way to resolve the problem. If the assumptions are not accepted, then all it is just a scream in the dark where you're bringing in something into the paradigm that you cannot really justify.
Yeah, and I like the way that you often answer the questions with questions, because that's something I never think to do. And I usually just go down the rabbit hole that they've opened up. And then you end up a lot of times just banging your head against the wall because you're arguing ridiculous things that don't make any sense. But you know what? It's funny because I actually haven't had a chance to read this book yet, and I can't wait to do it. But I was skimming this morning, and you just touched on one of the parts I was reading through, which was, I forget which atheist it was, but he was talking about the problem of evil.
Russell, maybe?
Yeah. And then you go back into how they look at good, though, and yet they understand that the reason for good, but then they won't apply that to the evil side, and they'll use that to justify that God isn't there.
Well, I think that is the classic fallacious starting point with which they go. The fallacious starting point is to say there's too much of evil and suffering in this world. And Bertrand Russell was asked in a debate with the Jesuit philosopher Copleston, how do you differentiate between good and evil? And Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green or yellow and blue or something like that. Copleston said, but you differentiate between these colors by seeing, don't you? Russell said, yes. So Copleston said, how do you differentiate between good and bad? And Russell, this brilliant mathematician philosopher, at that point looked at him and said, on the basis of feeling, what else? Now, that's an incredible response for an intellectual to give. As I often say, in some cultures, they love their neighbors, and other cultures, they eat them.
Right.
Does Russell have a preference in feelings? So obviously, he was assuming an objective moral standard, but when he was asked to defend his own, went to subjectivity. So the bottom line is this: if the subjective is all that there is and nothing more than that, what happens to the question? Why is the question a valid one? The question is a valid one because they assume objectivity all along. And so I think that's the way the question needs to be unpacked and teased out.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite responses you have that's on YouTube is one of your open forums that you did. And the kid gets up there and he asks why you're so afraid of subjective reasoning, and or subjective morality or whatever.
Right.
And then you responded, "Do you lock your doors?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." And it was like he didn't even realize what he was admitting to.
That was at UPenn. He walked up and said, "What are you guys so afraid of, a relativistic ethic?" Well, the reason he locks his doors, which he said yes to, is because he's afraid that somebody walking by his house will indeed be a relativist and not an absolutist. So our own divulgence sometimes ends up revealing to us that we're hypocritical in raising the question. Now, the question remains, Dan, I think that's the important thing to bear in mind, that yes, there is a problem of pain, there is a problem of suffering, but like G.K. Chesterton said, God is like the sun. You cannot look at it, but without it, you cannot look at anything else. It is when you bring the paradigm shift to a theistic framework, there is at least the possibility of an explanation and the legitimation of the question. Outside of a theistic framework, the question is really delegitimized.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to bear in mind.
Absolutely. Now, do you speak, obviously, to a lot of atheists when you're out and doing these forums and everything else, and I had a kind of a brief spat where I would respond to like the atheist hashtag on Twitter and just kind of post questions and try to start a dialogue, which, by the way, anyone listening, that is a terrible place to try to start a dialogue is on Twitter because you're limited to 140 characters and you're trying to explain these things and you've got 17 tweets going and it just does not end well. But I found myself actually almost depressed after a couple of days of doing this because it was just like I felt like I was trying to be as reasonable as possible and like you just it just doesn't get anywhere. So do you run into that personally?
Yes, and I think that's a very honest and fair representation. That's why I don't do those things, actually. To get in, trying to get into the enormity of a problem like that and limiting it to a handful of characters back and forth is actually to diminish the question. So we are on campuses where we have interactive forums. We allow them the possibility of asking questions, and when they ask questions, we interact. When we interact, it gives them a chance to come back at you. Yeah, we write books and we do respond, but we do not make it a minimalistic response.
Yeah.
For example, the whole issue of the existence of God, especially in the face of all that science affirms and believes. How can one do that without dialogue? You cannot do that in a monologue. I remember going to Cambridge in 1990, and at that time Stephen Hawking was going to deal with this huge question, are we determined or free? The place was packed, the Lady Mitchell Hall, and I was being my research student. I was able to get a ticket, and people had come from all over the world. The big answer from Stephen Hawking, are we so hardwired that we cannot rise above it and we are only forced to operate by the dictates of our hardwiring and so on? Or are we free? And he goes, of course he speaks through his speech synthesizer, pre-taped and so on. And at the end of it, after nearly an hour of a talk or something like that, he says, yes, we are predetermined. Of course, what else can he say as a naturalist? But since we don't know what is predetermined, we may as well not be, and so we plod along. there was a groan in the audience, an absolute audible groan. What did that prove? Even the most brilliant mind dealing with an enormous subject cannot possibly do justice to it in a 45 to 50-minute talk. So we have to be cognizant of that and find the entry point into the person's belief system, why he or she has come to this conclusion. Unpack that, and then you get an inroad into the answer.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the new atheists. I read your response to Sam Harris, and what I find interesting about the atheists today, and this maybe this is not different throughout history, I don't know, but it just seems like they have kind of almost an evangelical kind of disposition where they're not just content to be a non-believer, which I feel like is the most honest position. If you can't understand and you're not, I don't understand why you would want to then bring someone in to your what do you make of that?
It's a fascinating syndrome, actually. You talk about Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, who's now passed away, and Harris. They are sort of, they are evangelists, except the word evangelism comes from the euangelion of the Greek, meaning good news. There's not good news. There's really bad news that we're on our own in this universe. But they have that fervor and that zeal. Very few people have made as much money on the non-existence of something or entity as these boys have. They go on and on rewriting and rehashing children's versions, this version, that version. You don't make millions on that talking about the non-existence of the tooth fairy, which is what they say the belief in God is.
Right.
They're arguing against a coherent worldview very incoherently. What motivates them, I cannot judge. But here's the point, I think, Dan. Even Harris, in his latest writings, is sort of opening a back door to, quote, spirituality. They want the soul component in some way. Dawkins is talking about the possibility that there could be a deistic framework or some unexplainable origin theory, because the listener has to listen very carefully now. Even their theory of origins is really not a theory of origins. It's a theory of having something that got it started, and then they explain what we have. So it's not a theory of origins. It's a theory of what exists. The theory of origins is still in the naturalist framework with its feet firmly planted in midair. Now, once you move beyond that to metaphysics, morality, moral reasoning, love, hate, evil, relationships, all of these things, they actually have no explanation for any of this. So I think in grabbing the finger of one way of looking at reality, they think they have grabbed the fist of all of reality.
Yeah.
Of course, science has its legitimate place. Of course, it has its explanations, but it is very far from explaining what life is all about and its intended purpose and meaning and the ultimate values for which we go: truth, beauty, goodness, liberty, equality, justice, which is what the Greeks talked about. Those components only come in within, I think, a metaphysical framework, and only the Christian faith, I believe, the Judeo-Christian faith, is big enough to explain it coherently.
The thing that frustrates me a lot when I interact with a non-believer or an atheist, like kind of the hardcore atheist, is that they don't admit that they're making a truth claim, right? Mm-hmm. And I've tried to use this argument where, and you can tell me if this is bad, poor argumentation or not, but I was like, okay, look, we all know that life ends. They say they're looking for evidence. Mm-hmm. We all know life ends. We know that, here on Earth. What we don't know is what's beyond the door, like, arguing from their point of view. I would believe, based on the evidence of the Bible and what all the earliest humans said, that there is an afterlife. Mm-hmm. You say there is not an afterlife. Is that not a truth claim to say to know that there is nothing on the other side? Is that not and they'll say, well, you can't, the burden of proof is on you.
Yeah, they will. And in a sense, they're right in that. But if they only make the first statement that there is no afterlife, then it is a wrong approach to reasoning. If they say we are agnostic about it, we don't know about it, then you can begin a conversation. What do I mean by that? To posit an absolute negation on matters such as these assumes unlimited knowledge. If I were to say to you there's no such thing as a white stone with black dots anywhere in all of the galaxies of the universe, the only way I can make that statement meaningfully is if I have unlimited knowledge of the entire universe. Right. But for me to say there is such a thing as a white stone with black dots, I just have to have knowledge of that stone. So to demonstrate life beyond the grave, we need evidence that we can show to them. For them to say there is no such existence, they have to assume unlimited knowledge. But that in itself assumes that the very thing they're trying to deny. They say there's no creature in this world with unlimited knowledge, but they then assume unlimited knowledge and tell you there's no life beyond the grave. So is the resurrection from the dead a reality? Can it be demonstrated? Secondly, is there such a thing as justice that we must pursue? If there is no life beyond the grave, there is no such thing as ultimate justice. Is there the legitimacy of true love? If you have an objective point of reference, yes. If there is no objective point of reference, no, it's all a subjective emotion. So the major questions of life, they really have no answers to. Take just the conversion of 3 people in the New Testament: Thomas, the Saul of Tarsus, and James. These 3 dramatic changes after the resurrection are really enormous indicators of what actually happened. Then go back one step. If Jesus were a charlatan, I think this is very critical, Dan. If Jesus were just posturing, pretending to be some messianic figure, do you know what he would have really said? You kill me and I will spiritually rise again. How do you falsify that? He said, I will bodily rise again. That corpus claim, the corporeal claim of a literal, physical, bodily resurrection made it theoretically possible to be falsifiable if it didn't happen. I think that claim alone of Jesus Christ shows the legitimacy of where he was coming from. Otherwise, the whole thing would have literally died with his crucifixion. But his resurrection changed history, ultimately conquered Rome, and the transformation of the Saul of Tarsus to Paul, and the change of the Apostle Thomas. Saul went west, Thomas went east. Remarkable transformation because of the evidence of the resurrection from the dead.
That's a great point. And that is why, by the way, I have a business idea for you. Feel free to take this and run with it. But do you guys remember the little keychain sound effect things that they had in like the 90s, and like you'd press it and make really bad laser noises? I think we need a pocket Ravi. And so like when somebody comes up with a question and you don't know, you just pull out the pocket Ravi and just, oh, I got that. I mean, every time I watch a YouTube clip of you or watch or read something that you've written, I'm like, I'm like chomping at the bit to run into an atheist. Come on, I'm going to drop some Ravi bombs on him. But I wanted to ask you, what would you say, for both sides, what would you say is the toughest question intellectually for an atheist to answer, and what's the toughest one for a Christian to make?
I think it's the same question with flip sides. If the atheist truly believes that his or her strongest attack against the Judeo-Christian worldview is the problem of evil, which I believe is a legitimate question to answer, then he or she has to answer the problem of good. Where does our notion of good actually come from? Is it absolute or is it relative? Because where there's evil, you have to assume good. Where there's good, you have to assume a moral law. Where you assume a moral law, you have to assume a moral lawgiver. Why do we have to assume a moral lawgiver? Because all questions about evil are raised either by a person or about a person, which means personhood is considered intrinsically valuable. That is a claim naturalists cannot hold on to. So if personhood is intrinsically valuable, then we are the creation of a worthy God and an infinite being. If it is not intrinsically valuable, the question actually self-destructs. So we have to explain evil, which we believe we can with our beliefs. They cannot explain the problem of good, which they claim in the light of their attacks upon the theistic framework.
That's great. Ravi Zacharia, thanks so much for stopping by and spending a few minutes with me. And the book is Why Suffering? Finding Meaning and Comfort When Life Doesn't Make Sense. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.